My name is Cordelia Finch, and I'm 67 years old. Before you click away or scroll past this story, thinking you've heard it all before, let me tell you something. I thought I knew everything about my late husband until 3 months ago. I thought our 42 years of marriage held no secrets. I was wrong. And what I discovered in our attic on a rainy October afternoon didn't just change how I saw my past. It gave me a future I never imagined possible. So while you're subscribing and liking, let me tell you about the shoebox that contained letters I was never meant to find. About a man named Dalton I thought I'd buried along with my youth. And about how sometimes the biggest lies we tell are the ones we tell ourselves. The rain was doing that thing it does in Connecticut in October, not quite committing to a storm, just a persistent, melancholy drizzle that makes you want to stay inside and finally tackle those projects you've been avoiding. My daughter Vanessa had been after me for months to clean out the attic. "Mom, you can't keep living in a mausoleum," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular blend of love and exasperation that only adult children can master. "Dad's been gone 2 years. It's time." She was right, of course. Howard had passed in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March, and I'd been existing in this strange limbo ever since. Not quite living, not quite grieving, just occupying space in a house that felt too big and too full of memories all at once. So that October afternoon, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic with a box of garbage bags and what I thought was determination. The attic smelled of dust and cedar and time. Howard had been meticulous about storage, everything labeled, everything in its place. I started with the easy things: old tax returns that could finally be shredded, clothes from when bell-bottoms were fashionable the first time around, broken lamps that neither of us could bear to throw away because they'd been wedding gifts. It was when I reached for a box marked College HF that I noticed it. A shoebox, unlabeled, shoved behind the larger boxes in a way that seemed almost deliberate. It was an old Florsheim box, the cardboard soft with age. Something about it made my heart quicken. In 42 years of marriage, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts were screaming that this box was important. Inside were letters. Not just a few, dozens of them, bundled with string, the envelopes yellowed and fragile. My hands trembled as I pulled out the first bundle. The return address made my breath catch. Dalton Merrick, 412 Sycamore Street, Greenfield, Massachusetts. And the recipient was me, Cordelia Brennan, my maiden name, at my parents' old address in Boston. But I'd never received these letters. I'd never even seen them before. I sat down hard on an old trunk, the shoebox in my lap, and opened the first letter. The postmark was from August 1976, 49 years ago. The handwriting was Dalton's. That I knew immediately. I'd have recognized those bold, confident strokes anywhere, even after all these years of trying to forget them. "My dearest Cordy," it began. My eyes blurred with tears I didn't understand yet. No one had called me Cordy in decades. "I've written you 3 letters now with no response, and I'm beginning to wonder if you're punishing me with silence, or it's something else is at play." Something else was at play. Something I'd never known about. I spent the next 4 hours in that attic, reading letter after letter, watching the rain streak down the small window as the afternoon faded into evening. Dalton had written me 53 letters over the course of 18 months. 53 letters full of love, confusion, anger, hope, and finally, heartbroken acceptance. 53 letters I'd never received. And slowly, painfully, a story emerged that I'd never known. A story that changed everything I thought I understood about my life. Let me take you back to 1975. I was 18 and had just started at Boston University. I'd grown up in a strict household. My father was a banker. My mother came from old Boston money that had thinned out over the generations, but still carried weight in certain circles. They had plans for me, a respectable degree in education, or perhaps library science. Marriage to someone from an appropriate family, grandchildren, a predictable life of quiet gentility. Then I met Dalton Merrick in a poetry class, and all those plans evaporated like morning mist. Dalton was everything my parents would hate and everything my young heart craved. He was 22, a transfer student from a small college out west, studying literature and philosophy with the kind of passionate intensity that made professors either love him or dread having him in class. He had dark hair that was always a little too long. He wore the same leather jacket regardless of weather, and he read Rilke and Neruda the way some people read the sports section, daily and with complete absorption. He noticed me on the third day of class when I argued with the professor about the interpretation of an Anne Sexton poem. After class, he waited for me in the hallway. "You were right in there," he said, falling into step beside me. Professor Eldridge always misses the violence underneath the domesticity in her work. We talked for 2 hours in the student union, sitting across from each other at a scratch table with terrible coffee growing cold between us. He told me about growing up in a small town in western Massachusetts, about his father, who died in Vietnam when he was 7, about his mother who worked 2 jobs to send him to college. I told him about the weight of expectations, about feeling like I was living a life someone else had written for me, about wanting something more, but not knowing what that more was. "Maybe it's not about knowing," he said. "Maybe it's about being brave enough to find out." I fell in love with him that afternoon. Looking back now, with all these years between that girl and who I am today, I can see it clearly. The moment my life split into before and after. We became inseparable. We'd meet between classes, spend hours in the library pretending to study, while actually just talking in whispers that made the librarians glare at us. On weekends, we'd take the tea to different neighborhoods, exploring Boston like it was a treasure map. He introduced me to jazz clubs in the Back Bay and bookstores where the owners knew him by name. I showed him the museums my mother had dragged me to as a child, seeing them anew through his eyes. There was this one afternoon in particular that I've never forgotten, even though I tried for years to bury the memory. It was a Saturday in late October, and we'd taken the train to Salem for the day. The autumn colors were at their peak, and the town was full of tourists there for the Halloween festivities. But we'd walked away from the crowds, found a quiet beach where the cold wind whipped our hair and made our eyes water. "I want to remember this," Dalton had said, pulling me close. "Exactly this. You, me, this moment. I want to be 80 years old and still remember how you looked right now, with your cheeks red from the cold and your eyes reflecting the ocean." "That's a long time from now," I'd said, laughing. "I don't care. I want all of it. All the years, all the moments, everything." I'd believed him. God help me, I'd believed every word. My parents hated him on sight. I made the mistake of bringing him home for dinner 3 months into our relationship. My father barely spoke to him, and my mother's questions were like surgical strikes. Where exactly did he grow up? What did his mother do? What were his prospects after graduation? When Dalton left that evening, my father called me into his study. "This ends now, Cordelia," he said. "That young man is completely unsuitable. He has no family, no connections, no future that doesn't involve poverty and failure. You will not see him again." I was 18 and thought I was brave. "I love him," I said. My father's face hardened. "Love is a luxury for people who can afford it. You have responsibilities. You have a position to maintain. If you continue this relationship, there will be consequences." I continued the relationship. For the next year and a half, Dalton and I built a secret life together. I became an expert in deception, telling my parents I was at study groups when I was really at his tiny apartment near Fenway, saying I was staying with my friend Catherine when I was spending weekends with him, crafting elaborate lies that got more complex with each telling. It was exhilarating and exhausting. We talked about the future in whispers, making plans we half believed in. After graduation, we'd go somewhere new. Maybe California, maybe New York. He'd write, I'd teach, we'd build something real together. We'd get married in a small ceremony with just his mother and my friend Catherine as witnesses. We'd prove that love was enough, that all the conventions and expectations could be overcome with enough determination. But we never talked about the pressure I was under at home. We never discussed the threats my father made with increasing regularity, that he'd cut me off financially, that I'd regret throwing away my future, that Dalton would grow to resent me when poverty replaced romance. And I never told Dalton about the crying jags that seized me late at night, or how sometimes when I looked at him, I felt both absolute certainty and terrifying doubt in equal measure. The summer of 1976 changed everything. My father had a heart attack in June, not fatal, but serious enough to land him in the hospital for 2 weeks. My mother became someone I barely recognized, her usual composure cracking to reveal genuine terror. I spent every day at the hospital, watching my father look small and gray against the white sheets, listening to my mother's plans for what would happen if he didn't recover. "You're all we have, Cordelia," she said one evening as we sat in the hospital cafeteria. "If something happens to your father, it's just us. The money isn't what it used to be. We need you to make good choices. We need you to be sensible. Guilt is a powerful thing. It wraps around your chest and squeezes until you can't tell where your own feelings end and the weight of obligation begins." Dalton was in Greenfield that summer, staying with his mother and working construction to save money for our future. We wrote to each other almost daily, long, passionate letters full of plans and promises. His letters were lifelines during those weeks of hospital vigils and my mother's quiet desperation. Then my father came home, weak but recovering, and my mother's campaign began in earnest. She was subtle about it. She always was. She'd mention Howard Finch, a young man from a good family who'd just finished law school and was working for a respectable firm in Hartford. She'd arrange dinners where Howard just happened to be present. She'd talk about security and stability and what love looked like after the passion faded and you were left with bills and responsibilities. "Your father and I weren't love matches at first," she told me, "but we built something solid, something that lasted. That's what matters, Cordelia. Not butterflies and poetry, but partnership and respect." I met Howard in August. He was nice. That's the word that kept coming to mind. Nice, steady, reliable. He had plans for his career, for a house in the suburbs, for children and country club memberships, and a life that looked exactly like the one my parents had built. When he looked at me, he saw exactly what my parents saw. A suitable wife, a proper match, a life that made sense. He didn't see the person Dalton saw. He didn't know about the girl who argued about Anne Sexton, or who loved jazz clubs, or who dreamed of a different kind of life entirely. But here's the truth I've learned. We're all capable of betraying ourselves. We tell ourselves stories to justify it. We say we're being practical or responsible or mature. We say we're thinking of others, sacrificing for family, making the hard but necessary choice. But underneath all those stories is usually just fear. I was afraid of poverty, afraid of my father's anger, afraid of disappointing my mother, afraid that maybe everyone was right, and I was just a naive girl confusing infatuation with love. And so I made a choice. I told Dalton I needed time to think. I said my father's heart attack had shown me how fragile everything was, how maybe we needed to slow down, be more practical. He was confused but patient, certain that once things settled down, we'd be okay. "Take all the time you need, Cordy. He'd said on our last phone call that August. "I'm not going anywhere. I love you. That doesn't change just because things are complicated right now." But I was already changing. I was already pulling away, already constructing the walls that would separate the girl I'd been from the woman I thought I needed to become. I started seeing Howard. My parents were delighted. Howard was perfect on paper, and he treated me well. Took me to nice restaurants, brought me flowers, talked about his cases at work with an earnestness I found both touching and slightly boring. And I stopped answering Dalton's letters. That's the part that still shames me, even now, 49 years later. I didn't have the courage to end it cleanly. I just stopped writing. I told myself I needed space, that I'd figure out what to do eventually, that I was just taking some time. But really, I was taking the coward's way out. By November, I was engaged to Howard. By the following June, I was married. I packed away my memories of Dalton like I was packing away childhood toys, something that belonged to a previous version of myself, something I'd outgrown. I told myself I'd made the right choice. I told myself I was happy. And here's the strange thing about human beings. Tell yourself something often enough, and you start to believe it. Howard and I built a good life. We had 2 daughters, Vanessa and Caroline. We bought a house in West Hartford with a yard and good schools. Howard made partner at his firm. I taught English at the local high school for 20 years. We had friends and dinner parties and family vacations. We weren't passionate, but we were content. We were fine. And I never thought about Dalton, or rather, I never let myself think about him. When memories would surface, the smell of his leather jacket, the way he'd quote poetry at unexpected moments, the certainty I'd felt in his presence, I'd push them away. That was a different life, a different Cordelia. I'd made my choice, and I was living with it. There were moments, though, moments when the mask would slip and I'd catch a glimpse of what I'd given up. Like the time Howard and I were at a bookstore and I saw a collection of Neruda's poetry. My hand reached for it automatically, and Howard had said, "I didn't know you liked poetry." And I'd realized that in 20 years of marriage, he'd never known that about me, because I'd never told him. I'd locked that part of myself away so thoroughly that even my husband didn't know it existed. Or the time we were at a dinner party and someone mentioned jazz, and I felt this sudden fierce longing for those smoky clubs Dalton had taken me to, where the music was so good it made your chest ache. Howard noticed my expression and asked if I was feeling all right, and I'd said I had a headache, and we'd left early. These were small moments, easily dismissed, but they accumulated over the years like sediment, layer upon layer, until there was this whole stratum of buried life beneath the surface of my everyday existence. I was a good wife. I was a devoted mother. I taught my students to love literature, to see the beauty in language, to understand that books could open worlds. I volunteered at the library. I served on the PTA. I hosted book clubs and dinner parties and holiday gatherings. From the outside, my life looked full and purposeful. But inside, there was always this hollow space, this room I'd locked and thrown away the key to, where a different version of myself lived. The Cordy who'd loved fearlessly, who'd believed in poetry and possibility, who'd been brave enough to want something more than safety. Howard was a good man. I want to be clear about that. He never raised his voice, never was cruel or dismissive. He provided well for our family. He showed up to every school play and parent-teacher conference. He was faithful and dependable and everything a husband should be on paper. But there was no magic between us, no spark, no moments where our eyes would meet across a room and the whole world would fall away. We were partners, roommates, co-parents, but we were never quite lovers in the way that word should mean. Did he know? That's the question that haunts me now. Did Howard sense that I was only giving him part of myself? That there was a whole dimension of me that remained locked away. He never said anything, never confronted me, but sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Sadness, resignation, acceptance. We had a conversation once, about 15 years into our marriage. We'd just put the girls to bed and were sitting in the living room, and out of nowhere he said, "Are you happy, Cordelia?" The question startled me. We didn't ask each other things like that. "Of course," I'd said automatically. "Why would you ask that?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking at his hands. Sometimes I feel like I'm living with a ghost, like there's a version of you that's somewhere else, and I only get the echo. My heart had started pounding. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" He'd looked at me then, and there was something in his eyes. Not anger, but a deep weariness. "I've always known I wasn't your first choice, Cordelia. I made peace with that a long time ago. I hope whatever you chose me over was worth giving up." We never spoke of it again, and I convinced myself I'd imagined the conversation, or misunderstood it, or that it didn't mean what I thought it meant. Because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging everything I'd been trying not to see for years. The girls grew up. Vanessa became a physician, Caroline, architect. They both married, had children of their own. Howard and I became grandparents, sliding into that phase of life where you're supposed to slow down, enjoy the fruits of your labor, take pleasure in the family you've built. And then Howard died, peacefully, in his sleep, the way everyone hopes to go. One moment he was there, and the next, he simply wasn't. At the funeral, person after person told me how lucky I'd been. What a good man Howard was. What a solid marriage we'd had. How I should take comfort in the life we'd built together. And I did take comfort. But I also felt something else. Something I was ashamed to acknowledge even to myself. Along with the grief, there was a strange sense of release. As if I'd been holding my breath for 42 years and could finally exhale. Until that October afternoon in the attic, holding 53 letters I'd never received, letters that told a very different story than the one I'd been telling myself for 49 years. Because Dalton hadn't quietly accepted my silence, he'd fought for us. He'd written and written, his letters growing increasingly desperate, trying to understand what had happened. He'd driven to Boston in September, only to find out I'd moved and my parents wouldn't tell him where. He'd called my parents' house and been told I never wanted to hear from him again. A message I'd never authorized, a lie I'd never known about. The letters traced a heartbreaking arc. The early ones were confused but hopeful. Surely there was some explanation for my silence. Surely I'd write back soon. Surely what we had was strong enough to weather whatever was happening. By October, confusion had turned to worry. Was I sick? Had something happened? Please, just let him know I was okay. November brought anger. How could I just disappear like this? After everything we'd been to each other, didn't he deserve at least an explanation? December was pleading. He'd do anything, change anything, be anything I needed. Just please talk to him. And then came the letter from my mother. He'd included a copy of it in his final letter to me, and reading it now made my blood run cold. "Mr. Merrick," it began, in my mother's precise, formal handwriting. "I am writing to inform you that your continued attempts to contact my daughter are unwelcome and distressing to her. Cordelia has moved on with her life. She is engaged to be married to a wonderful young man from a good family. She has asked me to convey to you that she does not wish to hear from you again. Your letters are causing her considerable distress during what should be a happy time in her life. I must ask you, as a gentleman, to respect her wishes and cease all contact. Sincerely, Mrs. Eleanor Brennan." Every word was a lie. I'd never asked her to write that letter. I'd never said I didn't want to hear from Dalton. I hadn't even known he was trying to contact me because my parents had been intercepting his letters. And in his final letter, dated February 1977, 2 months before my wedding. He'd written something that broke my heart all over again. I understand now that you've made your choice, Cordy, though I still don't understand why. Your mother finally told me you're engaged to someone else, someone more appropriate. I hope he makes you happy. I hope he sees the wonder in you that I saw, though I doubt it. I hope you don't wake up 10 years from now and realize you've built a life that was never really yours. I hope you're brave enough to be who you are, not who everyone else wants you to be. I'll always love you. That doesn't change just because you stop loving me. I hope whatever you're running from doesn't catch up to you. Goodbye, my Cordy. I hope you have a beautiful life. I'll spend the rest of mine wondering what we could have been. Yours always, Dalton. I sat in that attic and sobbed. I cried for the girl who'd been, for the choice I'd made, for the cowardice I'd never acknowledged. I cried for Dalton, who deserved better than my silence, who'd loved me enough to keep trying even when I'd seemed to give up on us. I cried for Howard, who'd spent 42 years married to a woman who'd never quite given him all of herself, who'd known on some level that he was second choice but had loved me anyway. And I cried for myself, for all the years I'd lived in this comfortable numbness, telling myself it was enough, convincing myself I'd made the right choice, never acknowledging the price I'd paid for safety. But the tears weren't just about the past, because there, tucked into the last letter, was a small newspaper clipping. It was an obituary for Dalton's mother, Evelyn Merrick, dated just 6 months ago, and at the bottom, in the survived-by section, was Dalton's name, still living in Greenfield, Massachusetts. Still alive, still findable. Dalton was alive. And for the first time in 49 years, I was free. The next weeks were strange. I kept the letters secret at first, not sure what to do with them or with the feelings they'd unearthed. I went through my days in a fog, teaching my adult education classes at the community center, having lunch with my daughters, going to my book club meetings, all while feeling like I was split in two. There was the Cordelia everyone knew, and there was this other Cordelia who'd been buried so long I'd forgotten she existed. But she was waking up. Every time I read through those letters, every time I saw my name written in Dalton's hand, my Cordy, my dearest, my love, she became more real, more insistent. Vanessa noticed first. We were having coffee at her house, watching her youngest daughter play in the backyard, when she turned to me and said, "Mom, are you okay? You seem distant." "I'm fine," I said automatically, then stopped. How many times had I said those words over the years? How many times had I denied what I was really feeling in favor of what I was supposed to feel? "Actually," I said slowly, "I don't know if I am." I told her about the letters. I told her everything, about Dalton, about the choice I'd made, about discovering that my parents had intercepted his correspondence, about 49 years of living a half-life, of being only partially present, of locking away the parts of myself that didn't fit the role I was supposed to play. Vanessa listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Did you love Dad?" "Yes," I said, and it was true. But not the way I loved Dalton. I cared about your father deeply. We built a good life together. You and Caroline are proof of that. But it was a different kind of love, more like a partnership than a passion, more like friendship than fire. Did Dad know? I thought about that conversation we'd had all those years ago. I think so. We never really talked about it explicitly, but I think he knew, and I think it hurt him, even though he never said so. Vanessa reached across the table and took my hand. Her eyes were shining with tears. "Mom, can I tell you something? Something I've never said before." I nodded, afraid of what was coming. "Growing up, I always felt like you were muted somehow, like you were performing the role of mother and wife, but weren't quite fully there. I used to watch other kids with their parents and wonder why their mothers seemed so much more alive than mine. I thought maybe you were just naturally reserved, or that you didn't really want kids, or that there was something wrong with me that made you pull away." Her words were like a punch to my chest. "Oh, Vanessa. No, let me finish. It wasn't until I got older that I understood you weren't pulling away from us. You were pulling away from yourself. You'd built this careful, controlled life where everything looked perfect on the outside, but you'd sacrificed something essential to maintain it. And I think Caroline and I both grew up feeling that absence, even if we couldn't name it." I was crying now, great heaving sobs that shook my whole body. "I'm so sorry. I never meant. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought if I just kept going, if I just fulfilled my obligations, everything would be okay. But it wasn't okay, was it? Not really. And now you have a chance to do something different. So my question is, what are you going to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What do you do when you discover that the story you've been telling yourself about your life isn't quite true? What do you do when you're 67 years old and you find out that the great love of your youth never stopped trying to reach you, and he's still alive, still findable, still possibly what? What was I even hoping for? "I don't know," I said, but I was lying. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was just afraid to admit it. It took me 2 more weeks to work up the courage. I drafted and discarded a dozen letters, each one feeling more inadequate than the last. How do you reach out to someone after 49 years? What do you say? "I'm sorry" doesn't seem like enough. "I didn't know" feels like an excuse. "I never stopped thinking about you" is both true and completely insufficient. In the end, I kept it simple. "Dear Dalton, I recently found your letters from 1976 to 1977. I never received them at the time. My parents intercepted them. I only just discovered them in my late husband's belongings. I'm sorry for my silence all those years ago, and I'm sorry it's taken me this long to understand what really happened. I'd like to see you again, if you're willing. Cordelia." I included my phone number and mailed it before I could change my mind. Then I waited. 3 days felt like 3 years. I jumped every time the phone rang, my heart pounding like I was 18 again. When he finally called, I almost didn't answer. The phone rang 6 times while I stared at it, paralyzed by fear. What if he was angry? What if he'd moved on completely, and I was just a distant memory he'd rather leave buried? What if I'd built this up in my mind and the reality would be nothing but disappointment? On the 7th ring, I picked up. "Cordelia?" His voice was deeper than I remembered, roughened by time, and, I suspected, cigarettes, but still unmistakably him. Just hearing him say my name made my knees weak. "Dalton." My own voice came out as barely a whisper. Silence stretched between us, full of 49 years of unspoken words, of lives lived separately, of choices made and paths not taken. "I found your letters," I said finally. "All 53 of them. I can't believe you never got them." His voice was thick with emotion. "Your mother told me you didn't want to hear from me, that you'd moved on, that I was causing you distress. I thought, all these years, I thought you'd just chosen someone else. I didn't know you'd written. My parents must have kept them from me. Dalton, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to fight for us. I'm sorry I let fear make my choices. I'm sorry I let them convince me that safety was more important than love. I'm sorry for all of it." Another silence. Then quietly, "Did you have a good life, Cordy? Were you happy?" The question undid me, because he wasn't asking if I'd been successful or comfortable or secure. He was asking if I'd been happy, if the choice I'd made had been worth what I'd given up. "I had a good life," I said carefully. "I had 2 wonderful daughters. I had a career I loved. My husband was a kind man who provided well for our family. I had enough. But were you happy? No, I whispered. Not the way I could have been. Not the way I should have been. There was always this hollow place inside me, this room I'd locked up and thrown away the key to. And I told myself it was fine, that everyone makes compromises, that passion fades and stability matters more. But it wasn't fine, Dalton. It was never fine. I just got very good at pretending it was. I heard him breathe out, a long, shaky exhale. I need to see you. Can I see you? Yes, please. We agreed to meet at a small cafe halfway between West Hartford and Greenfield. Neutral ground. Safe. I spent an hour getting ready that morning, trying on and discarding outfits like a teenager preparing for prom. Nothing felt right. I was 67 years old, and I had no idea what you wear to meet the man you loved and lost half a century ago. In the end, I settled on a simple blue sweater that Caroline had given me for my birthday and dark jeans. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, an older woman with gray hair and lines around her eyes, carrying the weight of decades in her expression. This wasn't the 19-year-old Dalton had known. Would he be disappointed? Would I? The cafe was one of those deliberately vintage places that younger people seem to love. All Edison bulbs and reclaimed wood. I arrived early and chose a table by the window, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea I couldn't drink. I watched every car that pulled into the parking lot, my pulse quickening each time. Then he walked in, and time did that strange folding thing where the past and present collapse into each other. He was older, of course. His dark hair had gone silver, worn longer than was fashionable for a man his age, and he still had that same leather jacket, or one exactly like it. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had started keeping score of all the years. But his eyes were the same. That particular shade of brown that had reminded me of autumn leaves, intense and searching. And when he saw me, when our eyes met across that cafe, he smiled. It was the same smile I remembered, slightly crooked, reaching his eyes first. And just like that, I was 19 again, my whole future spread out in front of me, full of infinite possibility. "Cordy," he said, reaching my table. He didn't try to hug me or take my hand, just stood there looking at me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve, like he couldn't quite believe I was real. "You look old," I supplied. He laughed, and I remembered that sound, warm and genuine and entirely unself-conscious, coming from somewhere deep in his chest. I was going to say exactly like yourself, just more so, like time just intensified you instead of changing you. We sat down and started talking, and it was awkward at first. 49 years is a long time to bridge, and we were strangers now in all the ways that mattered. But then, easier than it should have been, like picking up a conversation that had only been paused rather than ended. He told me about his life. He'd gotten his PhD in literature from UMass and taught at a small college in Western Massachusetts for 35 years before retiring. He'd married in his early 30s, a woman named Patricia who taught art history at the same college. They'd had no children. Patricia couldn't, and by the time they'd considered adoption, they built a life that felt complete without them. They'd traveled extensively, had a house full of books and art, hosted dinner parties with colleagues that lasted until dawn. Patricia had died 4 years ago from ovarian cancer. "I loved her," he said, and I heard the truth in it, saw it in the way his hands moved when he talked about her. "Not the way I loved you. Nothing was ever quite like that. How could it be? But genuinely, deeply, she was my best friend. She made me happy. We had a good life together. I'm glad," I said, and meant it. It would have been worse, somehow, if he'd spent 49 years pining for what we'd lost, if he'd never found happiness because of me. "Patricia knew about you," he continued. "I told her early on. She said everyone has a first love, but great what if. She wasn't threatened by it because it was in the past. But sometimes she'd catch me listening to certain music or reading certain poetry, and she'd know where my mind had gone. She'd just smile and say, "Thinking about your Cordy?" And I'd nod, and she'd squeeze my hand. She was an extraordinary woman. I told him about Howard, about my daughters and grandchildren, about my teaching career and my comfortable suburban life. I told him the truth, that it had been a good life, but not quite the life I'd imagined for myself. That I'd spent 42 years being a version of myself that fit the role I was supposed to play, and that I'd only recently begun to understand how much I'd lost in the process. "Do you resent me?" I asked finally, the question I'd been afraid to voice. "For choosing the safe path? For not being brave enough? For disappearing without explanation?" He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table, and I watched those hands, weathered now, spotted with age, but still graceful in their movements. Finally, he looked up at me. I did, for a long time. I was angry and hurt and couldn't understand how you could just disappear like that. I thought I'd done something wrong, or that what we had wasn't as real for you as it was for me. The not knowing was almost worse than losing you. But then, Patricia helped me see it differently. She said sometimes people make choices out of fear, and you can either hold that against them forever, or you can try to understand the fear and forgive the choice. And you understood? Eventually. You were 19 years old, Cordy. Your father had just had a heart attack. Your parents were pressuring you. You were scared. I couldn't see that when I was 23 and heartbroken, but I can see it now. Life is long and complicated, and we're all just doing the best we can with what we know at the time. Tears stung my eyes. I should have been braver. I should have fought for us. Maybe. Or maybe we both did the best we could with what we knew at the time. Maybe that's all any of us can ever do. He reached across the table and took my hand, and the touch sent electricity through me. Different from when we were young. Not that urgent, desperate need, but something deeper, more knowing. The question isn't whether we made mistakes 49 years ago. The question is what we do now. ... We talked for hours. The cafe filled and emptied around us. The staff changed shifts. Afternoon became evening. We covered 4 decades in conversations that jumped from topic to topic. Books we'd read, places we'd traveled, students we'd taught, losses we'd endured. We talked about our children and grandchildren, about getting older and facing mortality, about what it means to look back on a life and try to make sense of the choices we'd made. At one point, he pulled out his phone and showed me pictures of Patricia. She was beautiful, not in a conventional way, but striking, with wild, curly gray hair and bright, intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses. In every photo, she looked fully alive, fully present. She would have liked you, he said. She would have understood why I never quite got over you. I wish I could have met her. I wish I could thank her for making you happy. She'd be glad you found the letters. She'd want us to have this chance. As the winter sun started to set outside the window, casting long shadows across our table, I finally asked the question that had been building all afternoon. What now, Dalton? What do we do with this? He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching my face like he was memorizing it. I don't know. We're not the same people we were. We're 67 years old. You have your life in Connecticut, your daughters, your grandchildren. I have my life in Greenfield, my colleagues, my routines. We can't just pick up where we left off. That's gone, and maybe that's okay. But, he smiled, but I'd like to try, not to recapture what we had, that's impossible, but to build something new with all the wisdom we didn't have before. If you want to. I looked at our joined hands on the table, his weathered and scarred, mine marked with age spots and the thin skin that comes with years. Not young hands, not the hands of 2 people just starting out, but alive hands, knowing hands, hands that had held others and built lives and survived loss. I want to, I said. I'm terrified, but I want to. I've spent 49 years playing it safe, and it cost me more than I understood. I don't want to do that anymore. What about your daughters? Vanessa knows. She's the one who encouraged me to reach out to you. She said I'd been living like a ghost for too long, and it was time to start living like a person again. That was 8 months ago. We've been taking it slowly, meeting once a week, sometimes in West Hartford, sometimes in Greenfield, sometimes at places in between. We take walks, go to museums, sit in cafes, and talk for hours. We've been to concerts and movies and bookstores. We hold hands like teenagers, steal kisses when we think no one's looking, stay up late talking on the phone like we're back in college. But it's different from when we were young. Better in some ways. We know ourselves now in ways we didn't then. We've lived full lives, loved other people, experienced loss and joy, and everything in between. We don't have the urgency of youth, that desperate need to possess each other completely. Instead, we have something steadier, a deep appreciation for this unexpected gift, this second chance we never thought we'd get. He's introduced me to his friends, his colleagues from the college, the people who formed his life in Greenfield. They were curious at first. Who was this woman who'd suddenly appeared in Dalton's life? But they've been kind, welcoming me into their book clubs and dinner parties. They tell me stories about Patricia, and I love hearing them, love understanding the life Dalton built when I wasn't part of it. I've introduced him to Vanessa and Caroline. Caroline was skeptical at first, protective of her father's memory, worried that I was somehow betraying Howard by pursuing this relationship. But Dalton won her over the same way he won me over 50 years ago, by listening, really listening, when people talk, by being genuinely curious about their lives, by quoting poetry at unexpected moments, and making observations that make you see ordinary things in new ways. I understand now why you loved him, Caroline said to me after the first time they met. He sees you, really sees you. I don't think Dad ever quite did that. We haven't made any big decisions yet. We're both too old and too wise to rush into anything. We haven't talked about moving or marriage or any of the practical considerations that would come with truly combining our lives. Right now, we're just together. Dating, I suppose, though that word feels absurdly young for what we're doing. But there have been moments that feel like glimpses of a possible future. Last month, I spent a weekend at his house in Greenfield. It's a small craftsman cottage filled with books. They line every wall, stack on every surface, create a kind of literary architecture that makes the whole house feel like a living library. Patricia's paintings hang throughout, vivid abstracts full of color and movement. I thought about taking them down, he admitted. Before you came, I didn't want you to feel like you were stepping into her space. But then I realized that would be dishonoring what we had. She was part of my life. She shaped who I am. I can't erase that, and I shouldn't want to. I'm glad you didn't. I want to know about her. She made you happy, and I'm grateful for that. We cooked dinner together in his small kitchen, moving around each other with the awkwardness of people still learning each other's rhythms. He made pasta sauce from his mother's recipe, and I made a salad. We drank wine and talked about books and music and all the years between then and now. And later, we sat on his couch, surrounded by all those books and all those paintings, and he read me poetry, Neruda and Rilke and Mary Oliver, and I realized I was finally home. Last week, he took me to a jazz club in Springfield. The music was too loud, and we were probably the oldest people there by 20 years. But when he pulled me onto the tiny dance floor and held me close, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Fully present, fully alive, fully myself. You know what I realized? He said, his mouth close to my ear so I could hear him over the music. What? All those years, I thought losing you was the tragedy. But maybe the real tragedy would have been if we'd never found each other again. Maybe this is actually the happy ending. Two people who loved each other, lived full lives, learned who they were, and then got a second chance to choose each other with eyes wide open. Maybe everything that happened had to happen so we could be ready for this. I pulled back to look at him. That's a very optimistic interpretation. I'm an old man, Cordy. I don't have time for pessimism anymore, and neither do you. He's right, of course. We're both old. We've both lived most of our lives already. We have health issues. His knees bother him. My blood pressure requires medication. We both need reading glasses and can't quite hear as well as we used to. We have complicated family dynamics and decades of habits that aren't easy to change. We have separate homes and separate lives and separate histories that can't simply be erased or ignored. This second act romance isn't like the first one. There's no grand passion, no sense that we're defying the world, no belief that love can conquer all practical realities. We're too old for that kind of innocence. But there's something better: certainty, knowledge, the wisdom that comes from having lived, having loved, having lost, and having survived it all. We know now that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice. It's showing up. It's being brave enough to be vulnerable, even when you know exactly how much it can hurt. It's looking at someone with full knowledge of their flaws and complexities and choosing them anyway. We know that life is short and precious and fragile. We know that time is the one commodity we can't buy more of. We know that playing it safe doesn't protect you from loss or pain. It just means you miss out on joy along the way. My daughters ask me if I'm happy. I tell them yes, and it's true, but it's a different kind of happiness than I've known before. It's not the giddy excitement of new love or the comfortable contentment of long partnership. It's something deeper, a sense of rightness, of pieces fitting together that I didn't even know were missing. It's the feeling of finally, after 49 years, being fully myself with another person. People our age don't often talk about love. We talk about health issues and retirement plans and grandchildren. We're supposed to be past all this, past passion, past romance, past the possibility of new beginnings. Society tells us that at 67, you should be winding down, accepting your lot, making peace with your choices. But here's what I've learned. Love doesn't have an expiration date. The capacity to surprise yourself doesn't have an age limit. It's never too late to be brave enough to choose yourself, to choose honesty, to choose the life you actually want instead of the life you thought you should want. I keep Dalton's letters in my nightstand now. Sometimes I read through them, marveling at the young man he was, the young woman I was, the love we had and lost. But mostly, I don't need to read them anymore. They serve their purpose. They woke me up, showed me what I'd been running from all these years, gave me the courage to reach out and claim this second chance. Because I have him now. Not the memory, not the what if, but the actual, living, breathing man. And yes, we're older. Yes, we're different. Yes, we can't get back those 49 lost years. But we have now. We have today. And for two people who've spent decades living half-lives, that feels like a miracle. Dalton and I are planning a trip to California next month, something we talked about doing 50 years ago but never did. We're going to drive along the coast, stay in small hotels, visit bookstores and museums and jazz clubs. We're going to read poetry to each other and hold hands and act like the foolish young people we never quite got to be the first time around. And if people think we're ridiculous, two old people holding hands and quoting Rilke and acting like teenagers, well, that's fine. Let them think what they want. We've spent enough years worrying about what other people think. We've spent enough years playing the roles we were assigned. We've spent enough years living carefully, safely, making the sensible choice. This time, we're choosing love. This time, we're choosing truth. This time, we're choosing each other with full knowledge of the cost and full commitment to paying it. Because here's the thing about second chances. They don't come without risk. People our age are supposed to be past taking risks. We're supposed to be comfortable, settled, resigned to the lives we've built. But comfort isn't the same as happiness. Safety isn't the same as fulfillment. And sometimes the biggest risk is never taking any risks at all. I think about Howard sometimes, about the conversation we had all those years ago when he asked if I was happy. I think about his quiet acceptance of my half-presence, his willingness to build a life with someone who was only partially there. And I feel a complicated mixture of gratitude and guilt and sorrow. He gave me a good life. He gave me 2 extraordinary daughters. He was faithful and kind and everything a husband should be. And I did care for him, in my way. But I was never fully his, and he knew it. And we both spent 42 years pretending that was enough. I hope, wherever he is, he understands. I hope he'd want me to finally be happy, to finally be whole. I hope he'd see Dalton and understand that this isn't about him being insufficient. It was about me never giving him all of myself, because I'd locked part of me away so long ago, I'd forgotten it existed. Caroline struggles with this more than Vanessa does. She sees it as a betrayal of her father's memory, this late-life love affair with the man who came before him. But Vanessa understands. She sees how I'm different now, more present, more alive, more myself than I've been in decades. You laugh differently now, she told me last week. It's like the laugh comes from somewhere deeper, somewhere real. Growing up, your laugh always sounded careful, like you were monitoring yourself, making sure you didn't laugh too loud or too freely. But now, it's just you. That observation made me cry, because she was right. I'd spent so many years being careful with my laughter, my opinions, my desires, my very self. Careful not to be too much, or want too much, or feel too much. Careful to fit into the shape that had been prescribed for me. But I'm done being careful. At 67, with more years behind me than ahead, I'm finally learning to be reckless, to want things, to take up space, to laugh freely and love deeply, and stop apologizing for the parts of myself that don't fit into neat, acceptable boxes. Dalton tells me I'm brave, but I don't feel brave. I feel terrified most of the time. Terrified of being hurt again, of losing him again, of this not working out, of running out of time before we've had enough time. But I'm doing it anyway. And maybe that's what bravery actually is. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. My name is Cordelia Finch. I'm 67 years old, and I'm finally living the life I was meant to live. Better late than never. Now I want to hear from you. If you've made it this far in my story, you're the kind of person who understands that life is complicated, that love doesn't follow a simple timeline, that sometimes the most important chapters are the ones we write in the final act. Please subscribe to this channel so you don't miss more stories about love, loss, second chances, and the courage it takes to choose yourself at any age. And I have some questions for you. Questions I'd love to see your answers to in the comments. Did you ever have a great love that you walked away from? Do you ever wonder, what if? Would you have the courage to reach out after decades of silence? Or would fear hold you back? Have you ever made a choice out of fear, choosing safety over passion, duty over desire, and spent years telling yourself it was the right choice? How did you make peace with that decision? If you found letters that changed everything you thought you knew about your past, what would you do? Would you want to know the truth, even if it meant confronting painful realities about choices you made and time you lost? For those of you who are in your 60s, 70s, or beyond, do you believe it's ever too late for love? Have you surprised yourself with new beginnings in what you thought were your final chapters? And here's the question that keeps me up at night. If you could go back and tell your younger self one thing knowing everything you know now about how life unfolds, what would it be? Please share your stories in the comments. I want to hear about your own loves and losses, your choices and regrets, your second chances and new beginnings. Because here's what I've learned. We're all writing our stories one day at a time, and none of us knows how our particular story will end. But we can choose how we write these final chapters. We can choose bravery over fear. We can choose truth over comfort. We can choose love, even when it's scary, even when it's complicated, even when we're too old for such foolishness. Especially when we're too old. Because if not now, when? Thank you for reading my story. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing that it's never too late to surprise yourself, to be brave, to choose love. Subscribe, like, and share your own story in the comments. I can't wait to read them. With love and hope for all of us still writing our stories, Cordelia.